I'd like to introduce our next speaker. Father Marinello Saguin. Did I get that, Saguin?
Yes.
That's right, Saguin? Good. Been practicing. Who is the associate pastor at St. Margaret Mary in Lomita. Was ordained to the priesthood in 2015. I think I have shoes older than you. So I love your young vocation. Felt his calling to the Lord in the second grade, and was the former vocation director for the San Pedro region of the Archdiocese, accompanying young men in their discernment process. I think he originally started your studies with the Carmelites, and the Archdiocese was able to poach you out, huh? That's great. Celebrated his first Mass at his home parish, Holy Family in Glendale. My friend Father Jim Bavacqua up there. Next time you see him, tell him I said hello. And a great quote from Father Marinello. And I believe this quote came not long after you were, you know where I'm going with this? Not long after he was ordained. And listen to this. A priest must have the heart to receive and give love. After all, he is a father to his people, who is pointing them to a reward that is beyond life. May I present you, Father Marinello Saguin.
Good afternoon. It's an honor and a privilege to stand before you as Serrans, because at some point throughout my whole formation into the diocesan priesthood and in religious life, that the Serrans have always been there behind us, praying, supporting, and loving. And to the very point that at my Ordinati luncheon, the Ventura chapter was so influential that they hosted, after so many years, that Ventura hosted the Ordinati luncheon instead of the greater LA area. So it's nice to be home. It's nice to be with you all. I'm a priest of the Archdiocese of Los Angeles, so welcome. Welcome also to Los Angeles. But before we begin, let's always call to mind that we are in God's holy presence and ask for the Spirit to come upon us just for this short session. Open my eyes, Lord. Help me to see your face. Open my eyes, Lord. Help me to see. Open my ears, Lord. Help me to hear your voice. Open my ears, Lord. Help me to hear. Open my heart, Lord. Help me to love like you. Open my heart, Lord. Help me to love. Father, in every generation you provide ministers of Christ and your church. We come before you now in this rally that we ask that you send forth more priests and consecrated women and men to serve your church. Give us priests and consecrated people who will lead and guide your holy people, word in sacrament, so that they may be truly strengthened and that we may truly become a Eucharistic church. Strengthen us in our own discipleship and in our own call, so that we can truly be that Serrans that call forth the gifts of so many. We make our prayer in the power and presence of the crucified and risen Jesus. Amen. I was given the daunted task of speaking on the new generation priest, whatever that means. But really, what I'd like to speak to you about is the context of priesthood, and in the context of young people that we call millennials and this new generation. I know we'll speak of it later on Friday. But let's just look at the milieu of our young people and where these priests and these young priests and young religious are coming out of. The milieu of these millennials, remember, range from 18 to 35, all right? And so right now the studies, especially in 2015 from the CARA, which is the Center of Applied Research in the Apostolate, has already realized that people are already leaving the church, that young people are already out of the church. And you may even have it in your own homes, in your own families, among your own relationships and friendships, that their children or your grandchildren or your children are not practicing or have drifted away or whatever it may be. So this applied research has already shown that in 2015, they have classified that there are three groups that have already left the church of young people that are affecting us already as a faith community. And so the three groups are the dissenters, the injured, and the disassociated, or the drifters, all right? So what are those three groups? Dissenters, injured, and the drifters, all right? So, injured. Young people in today's age are already injured by some point in their life and in their own experience. They have already experienced death and illness of a loved one or friend. They've experienced substance abuse, addictions, and everything else that have injured their friendships, that have inflicted wounds upon them. Some of our young people are already suffering from broken homes and families and unreconcilable relationships. They're injured by that. And so a young person who has been injured by those situations or more, really, has this experience of being injured and being wounded. And here's a church that is calling them to reconciliation and healing and everything else. They can't make the connection. Therefore, young people choose to live in a bubble. They choose to live as walking wounds. And they don't allow anyone, anything, or the church or God to enter into that wound. They like it that way. And so they never make the connection. It never blends in. So that's the injured. The dissenter is the one, we grow up in a culture, especially our young people, to ask the question, why? All right? You may even force your children or your grandchildren, let's go to church. Why? It's boring. Why? Why would I get anything out of it? There's always an old fogey who is up there, all right? It is an old church. Why? Because it is the faith of my parents and my grandparents, but it isn't mine. Because I'm so bothered and worried about my social relationships, my technology, and everything else, and my education and everything else, that I just live in that. So the dissenter always asks the question, and it even challenges you, challenges the church in her teaching, for example, on social issues, on moral issues, whatever it may be. But it even goes beyond that, according to the study, that the dissenter also even questions redemption, salvation, the incarnation, the understanding of sin, okay, and the understanding of heaven, hell, and purgatory, and judgment. That's even more fundamental. It's even doctrinal. It isn't just social teachings at this point for the dissenter. And then, thirdly, the third group, what's the third group? Drifter. Very good, drifter. Notice what I just said. A young person grows up in a culture, in an area, that they will step on anything and everyone so that they get to the best places. Even parents will do that in today's day and age. They will say, where is the best school so that I can send my child so that he or she can get the best education, so that he or she can go to the best high school, so that that best high school can provide, so that my young person can go to the best college, so that he or she can get the best job, internship, and then job, and then be stable. All right? It's a market. It's a market. And then from that, where can I get the best relationship, get the best wife, and everything else? This is why there's all these social apps, all right? People are not willing to have a relationship and build on that. Rather, I swipe and I match, okay? Match.com. So, because there's no one-on-one contact. And if they're so focused on that, faith and religion over time falls by the wayside. You may even have it in your own family and friendships. You will say, well, I have a child or a grandchild who I sent to Catholic school, I sent to catechism, to RE, to religious education or CCD. We went to Mass every Sunday. We had prayer in the home. And then what happens is, down the line, things get busy. Life gets busy. And so activity after activity, sport after sport, practice after practice, everything else. So maybe we miss an occasional Sunday. They go into college and you have no power over them, none whatsoever at some point. And so they fail to go to Mass. They fail to have a relationship with a faith community. And so they begin to drift even further. They may go when they come home for vacations, and they come home, they'll go for Christmas Mass or Easter Mass. But then they'll go back to the way of life, and they continue to drift. And then they have their relationships, they get married, and then they're challenged, well, we're not going to have a church wedding. We'll be all right. We'll have a destination wedding. We'll go to the Justice of the Peace. And that's it. They continue to drift. Or they may not even get married in the Catholic Church. And they continue to drift. They have children. And next thing you know, the children are not baptized. We'll make them choose. When they're ready, they'll make them choose. How can they choose if they do not have anything to choose from or anyone to choose from? I'll give you an example in my own experience in ministry. I went to a dinner party, so I was in my cassock, and it was a holiday party. And so I went, and I was getting my carbonara, and I had a glass of wine, and so I was just eating, and the house was full, and there was a couple of non-practicing Catholics, and so they said, oh, there's a priest here. And so the owner of the house, who are my friends, he said, oh yeah, that's our parish priest, whatever. And so there I am. There is this girl of 5, and she looks at me from top to bottom. I bet you she was even counting the numbers of my buttons on my cassock. And she says, who are you? And so the uncles and the cousins who were there overhearing this conversation taking place with this 5-year-old and this 33-year-old priest, he says, well, honey, he's a priest. Whoosh. And so next thing you know, she still looked at me, and then another uncle butted in and said, well, he works for God. Whoosh. And so after a while, she didn't bother anymore. And so she walked away. So after the party, I hung around, and I said, hey, who's that little girl? I even baptized her Annabelle, you know. And I said, who's that little girl? And she says, you know, Father, that's my grandniece's daughter. And it's interesting, she hasn't been baptized, and they don't practice the faith, period. And they even said down the line, we'll make her choose later on. We're not going to force her to. I felt sad for that child, because they said she is going to grow up in a much more vicious world, a much more isolated world, individualistic world. How can she choose if she doesn't know anything or anyone that's even spiritual? Or that she can't even name G-O-D, God. That she was completely glazed. He's a priest. He works for God. Glazed. It's sobering, isn't it? The statistic. And they continue to drift. And so what is the challenge now? As a young priest, a priest or young religious who are growing up in that kind of idea, what makes them say yes to that idea? Because they've encountered someone. They have a relationship with that someone. And that someone calls them to be better. You and I who are baptized are called to be better. That we are called every single day. If your 2 feet get off the ground today, it's a good day. You're not pushing daisies. It's a good day. Because you have another opportunity to manifest everything that God has given you to the people around you in your own little environment, and to call them forward to their own giftedness and to their own call to service, to live their own potential, so that they can smile at the world, even in the midst of suffering, in the midst of pain, and in the midst of just constant confusion. It takes very little, doesn't it, to be those witnesses in the world. And you'll even see it in the synod that we just had in Rome, that the whole point of the synod, at the end of it, the working documents and everything else, spoke that it's rooted in the Gospel of Luke, the road to Emmaus. That Jesus drew near to them, walked with them, broke open the scriptures for them, and broke the bread, and he was recognized in the breaking of the bread. The young man or the young woman who is called to vocation today, especially in the world and in light of the culture that we are living in, are called to exactly that same gospel of Emmaus. To walk with them, accompaniment, okay? To break open for them the scriptures, to break open to them the Eucharist, the sacramental life of the church, everything else, so that God can be recognized in their life. I'll tell you, this morning we've spoken about people who have influenced us. We've spoken about faith journey and everything else. In my own life, it began, as you heard in the introduction, at second grade. I went to Catholic school my whole life in Los Angeles at St. Francis of Assisi. And we had Sisters of Notre Dame. And so in second grade, I had Sister Mary Christopher. And Sister Mary Christopher was preparing us for sacraments, for reconciliation, and for First Holy Communion. At one point, her lesson was the Mass. And she had cards, maybe this size, a little bit bigger. And in each card, there had things for Mass, the different vessels for Mass, the different materials for Mass. Cruets, bells, chalice, ciborium. And we had to memorize those things, all right? Familiarize ourselves with the sacred. One day, as she was going through that lesson, I said, I'm going to use that one day. As a second grader, what would I know? Aside from just that and going to First Friday Mass, going to Sunday Mass and everything else. But Sister had it. She had that joy. She had that smile. She had that spirit of giving. And I said, if Sister could do it, I could do it. And then another part is, at my home parish at that time, there were 5 priests, because it was run by religious. And we would see them in the classrooms. They would play at recess. One of the priests would even give out holy cards and medals on the yard and everything else. People would just be buying for it. So I said, I could do this. I could peddle those holy cards and medals. And then shortly after that, in 5th grade, speaking of statistics, in 5th grade, I became an altar boy. And in my home parish at the time, there were only boys. This is very rare in 1995. A lot of parishes have already shifted that we have both girls and boys. We still had boys. And Father said to me, or said to us, there was a group of us, 5th graders. He says, being an altar boy is a school for the priesthood. Some of you, God will call to be priest. And you will touch the mysteries at this altar. You will be at this altar. And you will give God to the people. And some of you young boys are going to be fathers, and you're going to be husbands, and you're going to bring your families to Mass, and you will tell them why we do these things, because you understand it. So over time, loving that, and then speaking of spirituality and that, the environment, I began to go to First Friday adoration. I have a cousin. He was the same age as I am. And we would go to First Friday. It was half day every First Friday. So we'd wash up, we'd grab a snack at home, we'd be picked up by one of our parents, and we'd be right there adoring the Blessed Sacrament. And then we would serve First Friday Mass and First Friday benediction. All right? And then eventually the priest says, well, you're always here. Why don't you pray evening prayer with us? And so we picked up the little Christian prayer, and then we started praying with them, evening prayer, which would be the breviary. And then high school got active and began to be in campus ministry and everything else, service projects. And so we got to senior year, and it was time to apply. And I said, where am I going to go? And so I said, well, maybe I'll apply to a few colleges. So I applied to 6, just in case, you know. And then the 7th one was seminary here at St. John's, which is the city over in Camarillo, which is our seminary here in the Archdiocese of Los Angeles. And they had a college. We had a college at that time. And I applied, got accepted. The college closes in 2003. And so the cardinal at the time, Cardinal Mahoney, said, well, I will send 4 guys to go up to Mount Angel, which is in Oregon. So for some of you who are in the Pacific Northwest, you know it very well. It's run by Benedictines, and it was founded in 1889. Anyway, we go up, finish philosophy, and everything else. But I'll tell you, senior year in economics class, somebody taps me on the shoulder and says, hey, Marinello, where are you going for college? And I said, I'm going to seminary. And I went to an all-boys high school run by Capuchins, and they said, why? You see the question? Why? Why? Why would you waste your time? Why would you do such a thing when you won't have the regular college experience of fraternities, parties, and everything else? That was the question I was posed in economics class, all right? And I remember what I said. Why would I deprive God when God has been so good to me? That if this is what He is asking of me, why would I not take the first step? Remember what we just sang. Open my eyes that I may see. Open my ears that I may hear. And open my heart that I may love. A young man or woman who enters seminary and religious life is open so that God can use him or her for whatever mission and purpose. And let me tell you, the college years, we were 12. We ended 12, the fourth year of college. Out of that 12, there are only 3 who went into theology. Because they realized, because life is a journey and a process, that God was calling them somewhere else. And even in theology, people begin to realize and discern. So a part of also this new generation of religious and consecrated peoples and priests are that they are constantly called to this discernment, every single part of the process. And we tell our young people it's a process, that when you enter, you're not certain that you're going to make it. And so every year there are evaluations. So allow me then to give you what is being done now in this whole process. That when a young man or a young woman decides, with that spirit of openness, to enter, they go through the formal application process. They write their autobiography. They go through a series of interviews. In this case, for us here, and maybe in some other dioceses as well, they go through a series of three-person panel interviews. And each one is made up of a series of topics: sexuality, relationship, education, priestly ministry, the call to ministry, relationship with women and men, how does that work, everything else. When they go through that stage of their initial questionnaire, their autobiography, and those 3 interviews, a panel of 10, right, which is comprised of priests, 3 lay women, they come together, which also means our vocation directors, and we discern if this person is fit to take the next step, which is the formal application to the seminary. And so that panel meets 3 times a year. So we meet in the fall, we meet in the early winter, and we meet in the spring, because they all have to be ready to be moving by June, all right? By the summertime into orientation. We gather, we make the decision. I'll tell you, nothing is judged by isolation and by one person. When that panel comes together, the assessment panel, and they've read everything, we have to also keep in mind that we have to judge with the mind of the church. We may feel an affinity towards these candidates because we've journeyed with them. But we always have to think with the mind of the church and for the good of the church, especially in the world that we live in today and in the church that we live in today. That we're not only protecting ourselves, but we're also protecting their integrity as well. Will you make a good candidate? Will you be a viable candidate? And will you be a good priest? We make the decision. They go then to the formal application at the seminary itself, which is then a series of questionnaire, another autobiography, and then you provide all the documentation of academics and everything else. That seminary panel comes together, comprised 2 of 10 people, never in isolation, any judgment. It is always a collaboration. And finally, they make decision. They give the acceptance letter, and then the Archbishop approves that, and that fall, they come in. A brief rundown of this whole application series. Religious life may be a little different, but it still is done with a spirit of collaboration, with a spirit of people coming together and saying, who would make a viable candidate when it comes to our community, and how will they live that charism? Any questions? It might be. There is a series of standards. So maybe a panel, depending on how small or large an archdiocese or diocese is, that panel may be a bit smaller. All right? But it always has some layperson and a woman, because it gives another perspective. I'll tell you, in some of our assessments, we priests may not catch everything on the written word. And so what happens is sometimes it takes a feminine touch, all right, to pull out something and extract something from the documentation that says, we didn't look at this. I'll tell you, if something comes up and a question comes up from any of the assessment, all right, anything comes up, it stops until the question is answered and clarified, right? We just recently had an assessment, and it was over age, older gentleman. And so there was an inconsistency with his reporting. And so we caught it right away. He was a compulsive liar. Could you imagine a confessor who was a compulsive liar hearing your confession? You know? All right. Yes. Speak, Lord, for your servant is listening.
Is it a consensus of the panel, or is it a vote?
It's a consensus and a votation. So it has to have a majority. No. There may be sometimes a little discrepancy. So this is why the psychological evaluation that takes place after that assessment sheds more light. All right? So when the assessors come, the psychological evaluation is the next process. The medical, the optical, and everything else. Because you have to have good eyes. You have to have good teeth, according to Father Ralph, which is very true, you know. You have to have a good, sound, mental, sociological understanding of who you are. Because remember, we are building men of integrity. How can a man be full of integrity if he does not know who he is as a human being? Remember what Val said at the first session. They're human beings. Well, hell yeah. How God made himself human and incarnated himself so that we can be lifted up. A priest and a religious, consecrated person tries to lift every single individual that comes to his or her presence. Not only is bread and wine lifted at Mass, not only is the book of the Gospels lifted, but our very lives are lifted up so that it can be transformed. We have to have that much humility, you know, that much humility. I'll tell you a story. I think my time is almost over. What time is it? Oh, yeah, around there. One day, remember, I've only been ordained, it will be 4 years on May 30th this year. And it was my first year, maybe the first couple of months. Talk about new priests going through the ringer, especially now that we have very few priests. The learning curve of priestly ministry is very low. It used to be that priests could be associate pastors or parochial vicars for 10, 20 years before they get their own place. And in small dioceses or larger dioceses, that learning curve is low. After your first assignment or half of your second assignment, you're pulled out and you're taken into to become administrator and pastor. You're screwed. You got HR, you got budget, you got, documentation that has to be done with employees, all of this stuff. And I'm applying right now. My 4-year term is ending, and I actually applied for administration. But anyway, you pray for me on that, for my interviews. So, first few months, you're still adjusting to priesthood. You're adjusting to the person of priest. Remember, on the day of ordination, you were given the power of priesthood, the duty and everything else, the grace of it. But you don't understand the extent of priesthood until you start living it. It's the same way in married life. For richer or for poorer, in sickness or in health, till death do us part. Mwah! Let's go and party. But you don't know the extent of it until you start living it and waking up to that same person every single day and saying, holy crap, this is what I woke up to today. But you live it. You live it and you go through it and everything else. All right? Well, that's the same way in priesthood. So, one day, I said, well, it's another day. And I went to chapel, and I went to my holy hour, and I was complaining to God. I said, why did you make me a priest? Because it was a rough week. And it was a Saturday, I remember, when I went to chapel that day. And I said, why did you make me a priest? Because statistics will also say that the first 10 years, just like in married life, in religious life, the first 10 years are the hardest years because it's all about transitions, disillusionments, and everything else. Reality sets in. So that morning I said, why did you make me a priest? And I was going through this whole litany of the stuff that I've gone through and the experiences that week. And I was just laying it there, all right? Did I get an answer? No, absolutely not. But I got a sense of consolation that says, I could go through the rest of the day. I just have to hold on. At my parish, we have 2 hours of confession every Saturday, 3:30 to 4:30, 7:30 to 8:30. And there are lines. I said, where do they come from? It's like cockroaches, They come and they line up. One of my priest friends says, you should be so lucky that you have a line for confession because your people understand the understanding of sin. I just shut up after that. So I go in, and it's at the 3:30 hour. And at the end of the 3:30 hour, somebody comes in behind the screen, confesses. And at the end of the confession, the person says, Father, thank you for your priesthood. Oh my God. And so I asked, why? Why would you say, there's the millennial out of me. Why? I never caught it until now. And they said, because I've been carrying this sin my whole time, for the longest time. And it took you to extract it out of me. And I was sobbing on the other side. And I said, no, thank you. And it dawned on me at that moment. Here I was that morning asking, why did you make me a priest? Why do I have to go through all this? And yet it took a sinner that I reconciled to God that nobody else could do to tell me this is why you're a priest. This is why you've brought me back. This is why I call you Father. And so, I had the 5 p.m. Mass that evening. I celebrated that 5 p.m. Mass as if it was my first Mass in Thanksgiving. That I had another opportunity to stand at this altar, which I learned so many years ago that this was the school for the priesthood, that this is the mysteries that I perform, that I give to God's people, so that God's people could be strengthened. A priest enters into the life of his people every single step of the way. You saw that in all of the talks that we've given in your small group sharing and everything else. He's privileged to enter into that. And he just doesn't stay at the sanctuary for God's sake. All right? Or he doesn't just say greeting people at the patio, but rather he enters even into your homes. I'll tell you, I never miss an invitation. I try not to miss an invitation to people's homes. And going into the parochial school every single day. Even if I'm just there for seconds in their classroom. Why? Because it's sign and symbol. Especially for our young people who need signs and experiences, all right? Young people today are not told anymore, da, 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 and they'll believe it, like previous generations. Your mom told you to go to Mass, you go to Mass. No, they need to see it. They're all about experiences, right? Even the hipster generation, the hipsters, they love experiences. So, the church is calling us also to accompany these young people to give them the experience. And so they need visible signs of that. Okay? They need visible signs. I go to the bank and to the market with my collar or cassock, and one day I go to the bank and I'm depositing my little check, and they say, "Are you for real?" You know what I said? I said, "Honey, this is nailed on tight." I said, this is not Halloween. And the next thing you know, you have a conversation. Or when you go into the airplane, sometimes I go in my collar, and I always pick the window seat. And I wait until the lines are down. So basically all the rows are full. So I have to go, "Oh, excuse me. Oh, excuse me. And they just look at you as if you're an enigma. Or they'll look at you and they say, "Oh, Father." And they tell you your whole life story when you only got 10 minutes. But that's it. Jesus drew near and walked with them and opened to them the scriptures and the bread. And so today, as we pray for priestly vocations, for religious and consecrated vocations, that we be open to our own vocations, and that we accompany, and that we walk and draw near to the people in our own lives, in our own parishes, in our own homes, among our own relationships and friendships. And so let us pause and give thanks to God for this rally, for your own gifts, for your own vocations. Glory be to the Father, and to the Son, and to the Holy Spirit, as it was in the beginning, is now, and ever shall be, world without end. Amen. All right.